Your subscription is a huge help for this channel to continue growing and for us to share many more stories together. Just tap the subscribe button and it means a lot to me. Not every escape begins with a perfect plan. Sometimes freedom is born from the deepest fear, and true love appears when we least expect it, in the most unexpected place. Hello? Before continuing with this story, tell me in the comments where you're listening from. I'm excited to imagine where in the world my listeners are. Now, let's get back to this story, which may stir many memories and hearts. Miami International Airport bustled with the typical Friday night activity. Thousands of people dragged suitcases, rushed to the gates, said tearful goodbyes, or hugged each other again. But amidst all that crowd, there was one woman who didn't fit into any of those happy categories. Isabella Morales walked with quick but unsteady steps, constantly looking over her shoulder. Her hands shook as she held a small black backpack, the only thing she'd managed to pack before fleeing her apartment. At 26, she'd never imagined she'd be running for her life like this. The heels of her shoes clicked against the marble floor, creating an anxious rhythm that seemed to mark the desperate beat of her heart. Her ex-boyfriend, Ricardo Vega, had been pursuing her for 3 months. What had begun as a seemingly normal relationship had turned into a nightmare of control, manipulation, and threats. Isabella remembered the last time she saw him. He'd shown up at her job in the small bookstore where she managed inventory. With that smile that once enchanted her and now terrified her, he'd whispered in her ear, while pretending to be his usual loving boyfriend, that if she tried to leave him again, he'd make sure she lost everything she loved. That threat had been the final straw. That same night, Isabella had packed her essentials and left her apartment, not knowing where to go. She only knew she had to get away, that she had to disappear before Ricardo kept his promises. The problem was that she didn't have enough money for a plane ticket. She had spent her savings changing the locks on her apartment twice, on a security system that Ricardo had somehow managed to circumvent, and on consultations with a lawyer who had told her that without physical evidence of violence, it would be difficult to obtain an effective restraining order. As she walked through the airport corridors, Isabella felt a familiar presence. She turned around, and her blood ran cold. There stood Ricardo, about 50 meters away, scanning the crowd with those dark eyes that seemed to see through everything. He was wearing that black leather jacket she'd once liked, but which now gave her the creeps. Panic gripped her. She began to walk faster, almost running, desperately searching for a place to hide. She passed souvenir shops, restaurants, waiting rooms, but nothing seemed safe enough. Ricardo knew her too well. He knew how she thought, how she moved. It was then that he saw something that would change his life forever. In a more exclusive area of the airport, reserved for private flights, a group of elegantly dressed flight attendants were making their way toward a silver jet that gleamed under the terminal lights. The women wore crisp navy blue uniforms, carried small rolling suitcases, and displayed a professional grace that Isabella admired even in her desperate state. Without a second thought, without even calculating the consequences, Isabella adjusted her dark jacket, smoothed her hair, and began walking behind the group. Her heart was beating so loudly that she feared the other women could hear it, but she managed to maintain her composure. The private jet staircase was made of polished metal, and each step resonated with a metallic echo that seemed to announce her deception. But the flight attendants were engrossed in their own conversations about the flight they were about to attend, and none seemed to notice the intruder who had joined their group. Once inside the plane, Isabella gasped. She had never seen so much luxury concentrated in such a small space. The seats were cream-colored leather, so soft they felt like clouds. The windows were larger than those on commercial airplanes, and through them, you could see the illuminated runway. There was a small bar with glassware that looked worth more than anything Isabella had ever owned. The flight attendants dispersed throughout the cabin, beginning their routine preparation. Isabella stood in the middle of the aisle, unsure of what to do now that she'd come this far. She decided to head toward the back of the plane, where she hoped she could hide until all this was over. But before she could take 3 steps, a deep, authoritative voice stopped her in her tracks. Alexander Grant had been watching from his seat at the front of the cockpit. At 34, he had developed an almost supernatural instinct for detecting anything out of place in his meticulously controlled world, and that woman definitely didn't belong there. He rose from his seat with the natural elegance of someone accustomed to commanding any room he entered. Alexander was tall, with broad shoulders that perfectly filled his dark gray Italian suit. His black hair was slicked back with a perfection that spoke of professional care, and his blue eyes held the intensity that had built a real estate empire worth billions of dollars. Isabella turned around slowly, knowing she'd been discovered. Standing before her was the most intimidating man she'd ever seen. Everything about him screamed power and control, from the way he stood to the way he looked at her, as if he could read her every thought. The first lie she could think of tumbled out of her mouth before she could stop it. She told him she was part of the crew, that her services had been requested for the flight. But even as she spoke, she knew he didn't believe a single word of it. Alexander studied her silently for what seemed like hours, but was probably only seconds. He could see the desperation in her eyes, the way her hands trembled slightly, how she looked toward the door as if calculating whether she could escape. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to trick him, but there was something different about this woman. Her fear didn't seem directed at him, but at something or someone else. Instead of calling security, which would have been the logical thing to do, and what anyone would have expected from a man in his position, Alexander made a decision that surprised even himself. He told her that if she wanted to stay on his plane, she would have to pretend to work for him. Isabella nodded so quickly that Alexander almost smiled. There was something about this woman's vulnerability that touched a part of him he'd kept buried for years, a part that remembered what it was like to feel helpless, even though that had been a long time ago. The jet began to move slowly toward the runway. Isabella headed toward what appeared to be a small service kitchen, trying to look as if she knew what she was doing. She began opening cabinets, looking for something to do that would justify her presence there. Alexander returned to his seat, but he couldn't stop watching her. He watched her move around the cabin with clumsy determination, trying to serve drinks he hadn't ordered, arranging magazines that were already neatly organized. It was obvious she'd never worked on an airplane, but there was something endearing about her effort. As the plane gained altitude, Isabella finally relaxed enough to look out the windows. The lights of Miami spread out below them like a carpet of diamonds. It was beautiful, but it also represented everything she was leaving behind. Her job, her few friends, the life she had worked so hard to build. Tears began to roll down her cheeks before she could stop them. All the fear, stress, and uncertainty of the past few months finally caught up with her. She sat in one of the back seats and cried quietly, trying not to make a sound. Alexander had been watching her, and when he saw the tears, something inside him stirred. He rose from his seat and walked toward her, moving with that quiet grace he had honed in the world's most important boardroom. He sat down in the seat opposite her and handed her a white silk handkerchief. Isabella looked up, surprised by the gesture. Her eyes were red and swollen, and she looked so small and fragile in that moment that Alexander felt a protectiveness he hadn't experienced in years. He asked her if she was okay, even though the answer was obvious. Isabella tried to compose herself, to return to her facade of a competent employee, but Alexander stopped her with a look. He told her she could talk to him. He'd noticed she was running away from something. It was then that Isabella began to open up. She didn't tell him everything, not immediately, but she told him about someone who wouldn't leave her alone, someone who had turned her life into a nightmare. Alexander listened without interrupting, without asking questions that might make her feel uncomfortable. As she spoke, Isabella realized that no one had really listened to her for months. Ricardo had always dominated their conversations, always made everything about him. Her friends had started to drift away when they realized Ricardo wouldn't allow them to be alone with Isabella. His family lived in another state and had no idea of the seriousness of her situation. Alexander, for his part, found himself genuinely interested in what she had to say. In his world, most people spoke to him because they wanted something: money, connections, favors. But this woman didn't know who he was. She wasn't trying to impress him or get anything. She was just being real, authentic, vulnerable. As the plane soared through the night skies, their conversation deepened. Isabella told him about her love of books, about how she had dreamed of writing one day but had never had the confidence to try. She told him about her childhood, about how she had lost her parents in a car accident when she was 20, and how that had made her feel alone in the world. Alexander found himself sharing things he normally kept private. He told her about how he'd built his empire from scratch, but how success had come at a price: loneliness. He told her about how the people in his life always had an agenda, always wanted something from him, and how he'd learned to keep up emotional walls to protect himself. There was something about the darkness of the cockpit, illuminated only by the plane's dim lights, that created an unexpected intimacy. It was as if they were two strangers suspended in time and space, free from the expectations and roles they normally had to play. Isabella realized that, for the first time in months, she felt safe. Not just physically safe, but emotionally safe. Alexander didn't judge her, didn't try to minimize her fears, or tell her what to do. He was simply there, present, listening. Alexander, for his part, was surprised by how easy it was to talk to her. In his world of corporations and acquisitions, every word had a strategic purpose. But with Isabella, he could simply be Alexander, not the CEO, not the billionaire, but simply a man who had forgotten what it felt like to have a genuine conversation. The flight lasted 3 hours, but for both of them it passed like minutes. When the pilot announced they were beginning their descent toward New York, Isabella felt a mixture of relief and sadness. Relief because she would be away from Ricardo, but sadness because this moment of connection, this bubble of safety and understanding, was about to end. Alexander felt something similar. In just a few hours, this mysterious woman had managed to penetrate deeper into his psyche than people who had been in his life for years. There was something about her that calmed him, that made him want to be a better version of himself. As the plane descended toward Teterboro Airport in New Jersey, Isabella began to worry about what would come next. She had no money, she didn't know anyone in New York, and she had no place to stay. She had acted on impulse, driven by fear and desperation, but now she would have to face the practical consequences of her decision. Alexander noticed her change in mood, the way she'd tensed again, the way she looked out the window with anxiety instead of admiration. He asked her what her plans were once they landed, though from the expression on her face, he already suspected the answer. Isabella admitted she had no plan. She had spent almost all of her savings trying to protect herself from Ricardo, and what little she had used to get to the airport. She had hoped to buy a cheap ticket anywhere, but when she saw that Ricardo had followed her there, she had panicked. It was then that Alexander made the second decision that surprised him that night. He offered to let her stay in one of his Manhattan apartments until she could get settled. Isabella immediately protested, saying she couldn't accept such generosity from a stranger, but Alexander insisted. He explained that he had several properties he rarely used, that it wouldn't be a bother, and that he could consider it payment for his services as a flight attendant. That last part made them both smile, reminding them of the innocent lie that had started it all. But his moment of levity was interrupted when the pilot's phone rang. Alexander saw the man's face tense as he listened to the call. After a few minutes, the pilot approached Alexander with a serious expression. He informed her that there was a man at Teterboro Airport asking about the flight, claiming his girlfriend was on board and demanding to speak to her. He had described Isabella with perfect accuracy and seemed very agitated. Isabella paled upon hearing this. It was Ricardo. He'd somehow found out that she'd taken that flight and managed to get to New York before them. He'd probably taken a commercial flight that landed first, or he had contacts who'd given him information about the private flight. Fear gripped Isabella again. She began to tremble, imagining Ricardo waiting for her on the tarmac, ready to take her back to Miami, back to the nightmare she'd tried to escape. All the hope she'd begun to harbor during the flight vanished in an instant. But Alexander wasn't going to let that happen. He rose from his seat with a cold, calculated determination he had used to face the most difficult negotiations of his career. He told the pilot to call his security detail and make sure they were waiting when they landed. Then he turned to Isabella and promised her that the man would not come near her. Isabella couldn't believe what she was hearing. This man, who had met her just hours before, was willing to protect her from Ricardo. No one had ever done that for her before. Neither her friends, nor her family, nor the authorities had taken her fears as seriously as Alexander was doing at that moment. Alexander explained that he had resources and connections that Ricardo couldn't touch, that he could guarantee her legal and physical protection, that he could make Ricardo disappear from her life permanently if she so desired. As the plane touched down on the runway at Teterboro, Isabella clung to Alexander's arm. She could see the airport lights through the windows, and she knew that somewhere out there, Ricardo was waiting. Alexander squeezed her hand and assured her that everything would be fine. He'd called his head of security, Marcus Thompson, a former Marine who had been with him for 5 years and knew exactly how to handle situations like this. The plane stopped in a private area of the airport, away from the main terminal. Alexander looked out the window and saw Marcus waiting with 2 other members of his security team. He also saw a familiar figure pacing nervously near the main entrance to the private aviation area. Ricardo Vega looked exactly as Isabella had described him, medium-height athletic build, with that dangerous intensity in his eyes that Alexander immediately recognized. He had seen that same intensity in men who had tried to blackmail or intimidate him over the years. It was the look of someone who believed he could control others through fear. Alexander asked Isabella to wait inside the plane while he exited first. He wanted to assess the situation and make sure his team was in position before she had to confront Ricardo. When Alexander got off the plane, Ricardo immediately approached him. He introduced himself as Isabella's concerned boyfriend, explaining that she had had an emotional episode and that he was there to take her home to safety. His performance was convincing, the kind of emotional manipulation that had probably worked on other people in the past. But Alexander had built his fortune by reading people, identifying their true motivations beneath the facades they presented. And everything about Ricardo screamed danger. The way he spoke of Isabella as if she were his property, the way his eyes hardened when he mentioned that she had tried to leave him, the toxic possessiveness he tried to disguise as love and concern. Alexander told Ricardo that Isabella didn't want to see him, that she had been very clear about that, and that he would respect her wishes. Ricardo immediately changed tactic, becoming more aggressive. He demanded to know who Alexander was and what right he had to interfere in their relationship. It was then that Alexander revealed his identity. He told Ricardo exactly who he was, mentioned some of the most recognizable properties he owned in Manhattan, some of the corporations he controlled. He saw Ricardo's eyes widen as he realized the magnitude of power and resources he was facing. Alexander explained to Ricardo that Isabella was under his protection now, and that if he tried to contact her, follow her, or intimidate her in any way, he would find himself facing not only criminal charges, but also the full weight of his legal and financial resources. Richard tried to maintain his bravado, but Alexander could see that he was calculating his options. Men like Richard were fundamentally cowards. They only felt powerful when they had an advantage over someone more vulnerable. Confronted with an opponent who was more powerful than them, they usually quickly deflated. Marcus and his team approached, flanking Ricardo in a way that made it clear this wasn't a coincidence. They were professional, ex-military and ex-security agents who knew exactly how to intimidate without crossing legal lines. Alexander gave Ricardo one last chance to leave voluntarily. He explained that he could walk toward the exit right now and never try to contact Isabella again. Or he could take the hard road and discover exactly how much influence Alexander had in the legal system. Ricardo looked around, assessing his options. He was alone, in unfamiliar territory, facing a man with virtually unlimited resources and a professional security team. For the first time in months, he had no advantage over Isabella, and that infuriated him as much as it scared him. But he wasn't stupid. He knew when he was overwhelmed. With one last angry glance toward the plane where he knew Isabella was hiding, Ricardo walked away, but not before making a subtle threat, promising that this situation wasn't over. Alexander watched Ricardo walk away and felt a cold satisfaction. He had faced corporate thugs who were far more sophisticated and dangerous than Ricardo Vega. This man was a problem he could solve, and he would make sure he was never a threat to Isabella again. When Alexander boarded the plane again, he found Isabella sitting where he'd left her, but now she was crying. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of an emotional release she'd been holding back for months. He told her that he had heard part of the conversation through the open windows of the plane, that he had seen how Alexander had faced Ricardo without fear, how he had protected him when no one else had. Alexander sat next to her and assured her that Ricardo would never bother her again. He explained that he had contacts in the New York and Miami police who would ensure that if Ricardo violated any restraining order or tried to approach her, he would face immediate and severe consequences, but more than legal protection. Isabella was overwhelmed by the fact that someone had believed in her, had taken her fears seriously, had been willing to use their power to protect her. For months, she had felt she was alone against Ricardo, that no one truly understood the danger he represented. As they headed toward Manhattan in Alexander's limo, Isabella looked out the window at the illuminated skyscrapers of the city that never slept. It was beautiful, but also intimidating. New York represented a new beginning, but also the unknown. Alexander noticed her contemplative silence and asked what she was thinking. Isabella admitted that she was overwhelmed by everything she had been through, by the generosity he had shown her, by the prospect of starting a whole new life in a city where she knew no one. Alexander assured her she wouldn't be alone. He explained that he had contacts in the New York publishing industry, and that if she was really interested in writing, he could help her make connections. He also offered her a temporary job in one of his offices if she needed an income while she settled in. Isabella protested again, feeling she had already accepted too much help from him. But Alexander insisted it wasn't charity. He explained that he had seen something in her that night, an inner strength that had driven her to make brave decisions even when she was terrified. Those were the qualities he valued in the people he worked with. The apartment he took her to was on the Upper East Side, in a limestone building that exuded elegance and history. The doorman greeted them by name, Alexander, and Isabella realized that this was indeed the world he lived in, a world of privilege and luxury that was completely outside her experience. The apartment itself was impressive but not ostentatious. It had large windows overlooking Central Park, hardwood floors, and a decor that combined modern elements with classic pieces. It was the kind of place Isabella had only seen in home decor magazine. Alexander showed her the apartment, explaining where everything was, making sure she felt comfortable. He left her his personal phone number and told her to call him if she needed anything, no matter the time. Before leaving, Alexander paused in the doorway and looked at her with an expression Isabella couldn't fully read. There was gratitude there, but also something deeper, something that spoke of connection and possibility. He told her that night had been special for him too, that it had been a long time since he'd had such a real conversation with someone. He thanked her for reminding him that there were still genuine people in the world, people who didn't want something from him. Isabella woke up the next morning in the most comfortable bed she'd slept in years, in an apartment filled with sunlight, filtering through the translucent curtains. For a moment, she wondered if it had all been a dream. The plane, Alexander, the confrontation with Ricardo. But then she saw her reflection in the bathroom mirror and knew it had all been real. She showered with luxury products that probably cost more than she earned in a week, dressed in the same clothes she'd worn the day before, and went out to explore her new neighborhood. Everything was different from Miami. The pace of the people, the architecture, even the air had a different energy. She found a small cafe on a corner and ordered a coffee and a croissant, savoring the simple normality of the moment. As she sat by the window, watching New Yorkers begin their day, her phone rang. It was Alexander. He asked her how she slept, if she needed anything, if she felt safe. There was a warmth in his voice that reassured her, a genuine concern she wasn't used to receiving. She told him about her morning walk, about how everything seemed new and exciting. Alexander mentioned he had some meetings that day but would like to take her out to dinner that evening if she wanted, to show her some of his favorite places in the city. Isabella agreed, feeling a mix of nerves and excitement. She wasn't sure if this was a date or just Alexander being kind to someone he'd helped. But either way, she was excited to spend more time with him. That night, Alexander took her to a small Italian restaurant in Little Italy, a place that had been in the same family for 3 generations. It wasn't the fancy, expensive place Isabella would have expected, but a warm and welcoming place where Alexander was clearly a valued customer. Over dinner, they talked about their lives in more depth than they had the night before. Alexander told her about his difficult childhood, growing up in a poor Brooklyn neighborhood with a mother who worked 3 jobs to support him and his younger sister. He told her about earning a scholarship to college, about the sacrifices he'd made to build his company. Isabella shared her own dreams and fears, her aspirations as a writer that she had put on hold when she met Ricardo, who had systematically undermined her confidence by telling her she had no talent and that she should focus on being more practical. Alexander encouraged her to resume her writing, telling her he could see her creativity in the way she spoke, in the observations she made about the people and places they had seen together. For the first time in years, Isabella felt seen and valued for who she truly was. Over the next few weeks, they developed a routine. Alexander worked during the day, managing his various businesses and investments, while Isabella explored the city, visited bookstores and museums, and slowly began to write again. In the evenings, they often had dinner together. Alexander would show her different aspects of New York, from neighborhood restaurants to Broadway shows, from art galleries to evening strolls through Central Park. With each shared experience, their connection deepened. Isabella began to see beyond Alexander's wealth and power. She saw his genuine generosity, not just with money, but with his time and attention. She saw his emotional intelligence, his ability to truly listen when she spoke. She saw his vulnerability when he spoke about his loneliness, about how success had come at the price of authentic relationships. Alexander, for his part, found himself changing in subtle but significant ways. The time he spent with Isabella had become his favorite part of the day. His perspective on what truly mattered in life began to shift. The accomplishments that once defined him seemed empty compared to the simple joy of making Isabella laugh, of seeing her eyes light up when she discovered something new in the city. A month after that night on the plane, Isabella received a call that would change everything again. It was from the Miami police, informing her that Ricardo had been arrested for stalking another woman. Apparently, after her encounter with Alexander, he had turned his obsession toward another victim, but this time he had crossed clear legal lines that he could no longer deny. Isabella felt a mixture of relief and guilt. Relief, because Ricardo would finally face consequences for his behavior, but guilt, because another woman had had to suffer what she had experienced. Alexander comforted her, reminding her that she wasn't responsible for Ricardo's actions, that she had done the right thing by walking away when she could. With Ricardo permanently out of her life, Isabella felt truly free for the first time in years. She began writing with renewed passion, pouring all her experiences of the past few months into a novel about a woman who finds the courage to escape a toxic relationship and discovers true love in the most unexpected place. Alexander read every chapter she wrote, offering encouragement and insight that helped her delve deeper into her work. His belief in her talent motivated her to keep writing, even when she doubted herself. One spring night, 3 months after their first meeting, Alexander took Isabella to the rooftop of one of his buildings in Manhattan. From there, the entire city stretched out before them like a sea of lights. It was beautiful and romantic, but Isabella could sense that Alexander had something important to tell her. Finally, Alexander confessed that he had fallen in love with her. He told her he had never expected to find anything real in her world of trading and strategy, but that she had changed all that. He told her that, with her, he felt like the best version of himself, that he had remembered what it meant to live instead of merely exist. Isabella felt her heart filled with a joy she had never experienced before. She told him that she, too, had fallen in love, that he had come into her life at the exact moment she needed him most, not only to save her from Ricardo, but to show her what it was like to be truly valued and loved. They kissed under the stars, with the entire city as their witness. And in that moment they knew that what had begun as a desperate escape had become the start of something beautiful and lasting. 6 months later, Isabella finished her novel. Alexander used his connections to help her find a literary agent, but the work spoke for itself. The story of a woman who finds the courage to escape and the love to heal resonated with editors and readers alike. When the book was published a year later, Isabella dedicated the first page to the stranger on the plane who taught me that sometimes fate has a better plan than ours. Alexander kept that dedication framed in his office, next to a photo of them on the rooftop, where they confessed their love. It was a reminder that life's best gifts often come disguised as unexpected interruptions. At their wedding, held 2 years later in a small garden on Long Island, Isabella wore a necklace with a small silver airplane, a gift from Alexander that symbolized the flight that had changed their lives. During their vows, Alexander told Isabella that she had been the most important passenger he had ever taken aboard his plane, not only because she had brought love into his life, but because she had reminded him of the importance of compassion, courage, and being there for others. Isabella replied that he had been more than her savior. He had been her teacher in what it meant to be truly free, not only from external circumstances, but from the internal fears that had limited her for so long. Years later, when they told their story to friends and family, they always ended with the same reflection, that sometimes the best things in life come when we least expect them, when we are willing to take brave risks, and when we open our hearts to possibilities we would never have imagined. Isabella continued writing, publishing several more novels that explored themes of redemption, courage, and transformative love. Alexander expanded his real estate empire, but also established a foundation that helped women escaping abusive relationships. Inspired by Isabella's experience and his desire to ensure other women had the resources and support they needed, their love grew and deepened with each passing year. They had 2 children, a girl and a boy, whom they raised with the values of compassion, courage, and the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. Little Sophia, their eldest daughter, often asked about how her parents met. Isabella and Alexander told her an age-appropriate account of a chance encounter on an airplane, about how sometimes the best adventures begin when we're willing to be brave. One night, when Sophia was 8 years old, she found her parents on the balcony of their house, looking at the stars as they had done that first night on the rooftop. She asked them why they always seemed so happy when they were together. Isabella and Alexander exchanged a look filled with understanding and love accumulated over the years. Alexander told Sophia that when you find the right person, the person who truly sees you and loves you for who you are, every day feels like a gift. Isabella added that true love isn't just about happy moments, but about being there for someone when they need you most, about choosing to be brave together, about creating something beautiful out of difficult circumstances. That night, after Sophia went to sleep, Isabella and Alexander stayed up talking about their journey together, about how a night of fear and despair had turned into a lifetime of love, purpose, and joy. Alexander told Isabella that, If he could go back and change anything about that night on the plane, he wouldn't. Every moment of uncertainty, every tear, every moment of vulnerability had been necessary to get them to where they were now. Isabella agreed, remembering how she had thought she was losing everything when she ran away from Ricardo. But in reality, she was running toward everything that truly mattered. They talked about how they wanted their children to understand that real love takes courage, that sometimes you have to be willing to leave behind what's familiar and comfortable to find what truly belongs to you. As the city slept around them, Isabella and Alexander realized their story had evolved beyond a romance. It had become a testament that it's possible to rebuild your life, that it's never too late to be brave, and that true love not only heals the past, but creates a future more beautiful than you could have ever imagined alone. Their story had become legendary in their circle of friends and family, not because it was perfect, but because it was real. They had faced challenges together, grown and changed, and learned to support each other through life's inevitable ups and downs. Isabella often reflected on how a single brave decision had changed the entire trajectory of her life. If she hadn't had the courage to get on that plane, if she hadn't been willing to trust a stranger, if she hadn't been open to the possibility of something better, she would never have known the love that now defined her existence. Alexander, for his part, had learned that true success wasn't measured solely in terms of professional achievements or wealth accumulation. True success was finding someone to share your life with, creating a loving family, and using the resources and privileges you had to make a positive difference in the lives of others. And so, after everything she'd been through, she understood that true love doesn't always arrive with fireworks and grand promises. Sometimes it blossoms quietly, in the kindness of a stranger, in the protection offered without asking for anything in return, in the patience to watch someone heal and grow. Sometimes the deepest love is born from the courage of two people to be vulnerable, to trust, to build something beautiful on the foundations of truth and compassion. Have you ever experienced a moment that completely changed the course of your life? I'd love to read your experience in the comments. Like if you believe everyone deserves a second chance at love. Share this story with someone special, and subscribe to continue hearing stories that touch the soul. If you made it to the end, leave in the comments what you liked most about the story, or if you related in any way, or what you liked about this story. Write in the comments. I'd love to know.